This is the Profiting from Misery Q&A with Open Secrets researchers Michael Marchant and Zen Mate, hosted by Open Secrets intern Hlokhi Ndlovu. Hi Michael, hi Zen. Thank you for joining me today for the Q&A.
Morning, Hlokhi.
Morning, Hlokhi. Thank you for having us.
Start things off, and for those who may not be aware, what exactly is profiting from misery?
So Profiting from Misery is Open Secrets' new investigative report. And it reveals South Africa's complicity in war crimes in Yemen. And so the South African arms companies that have cashed in on the sale of weapons to, in particular, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who have been two central parties to the Yemeni conflict. The report is an in-depth investigative report, which shows that since the war in Yemen broke out, several South African companies, arms companies, such as Rheinmetall Denel Munitions and Hensoldt, who are based in Germany, have joined many global companies in profiting from the devastation of the war in Yemen and the resulting misery from that. So the report unpacks how both these companies, in particular Rheinmetall Denel, are majority, even though they're majority owned in Germany, where there has been a ban on weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their South African subsidiaries have continued to export weapons to these countries. And this has provided a neat channel for German weapons to be continuing to fuel, through South African companies, the war in Yemen. The report also speaks to the failure of South Africa's regulator of the weapons trade to stop these weapons from leaving the country and from fueling the war.
So what prompted this investigation, and why is this particular report so important?
We've at Open Secrets have been engaged with civil society partners in different parts of the world who had already been looking at the issue of arms companies selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE that were being used in Yemen. And what these partners were telling us and showing us was this concern, as Zen has already said, about European arms companies in particular, looking at a German company like Rheinmetall, who had been stopped from sending weapons from Germany. And this open question was, were these companies using South Africa as a jurisdiction, in a sense, to sidestep the domestic bans and export weapons from South Africa instead of their home countries? And I mean, we thought that this was an important thing to look at because, well, first of all, Yemen, the humanitarian crisis there is likely the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. There's a huge amount of suffering there. And I think our concern was South Africa as a country and the corporations that are based here should not be allowed to profit from that kind of situation. And so the investigation was really aimed at trying to reveal South Africa's role in this regard and whether it was true that these types of companies were exporting weapons from here. And as Zen has already said, that's certainly what we found. That over the past 10 years, South Africa's involvement in selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE has only increased. We're talking about 12 billion rand in weapons over the last 10 years. More than 8 billion of that has come since the war started in late 2014, early 2015 in Yemen.
So as Mike has stated, Yemen has been declared a humanitarian crisis by the UN for consecutive years now. Who is responsible for this, and how has the COVID crisis impacted the situation there? Zed?
No, so as you've said, Hlokhi, and as Mike mentioned just now as you were speaking, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis that we face in the contemporary world right now. And it's the epicenter of this regionalized war. And as you've mentioned, the United Nations reports show extensive evidence that civilians have been deliberately targeted in this brutal conflict. So while the conflict is complex and there is evidence of widespread abuse by all the parties involved, the coalition of forces led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE have used their considerable military might to unleash the barrage of attacks on the civilian population. So that's really who is responsible. And so Saudi Arabia and the UAE and their proxies have used the weaponry sourced from other companies, arms companies from around the world, including South Africa. And so these states, which include South Africa, are also the parties that are responsible for this humanitarian crisis that is faced by the people in Yemen today.
Thank you, Zain. And with regards to the COVID crisis that's happening, how has this impacted the situation there?
This has impacted the situation as the war and the attacks unleashed have, as I've mentioned, targeted civilian populations and critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, roads, and the like. And so that has been exasperated by the COVID crisis, as people in Yemen are unable to access basic medical care that, as we know, has been essential in this COVID crisis. And even with that medical care, we know around the world, people barely, the virus has continued to run rampage. And so in Yemen, with the populations already plagued by other diseases, already unable to have access to basic facilities, this has made it even harder for them to deal with what is essentially a huge crisis compounded onto another crisis that has been ongoing for years, which is the civil war there.
Very true. So South Africa has portrayed itself as a country championing the values of human rights, democracy, reconciliation. Shouldn't we have the mechanisms to prevent the complicity of South Africa and South African corporations in human rights violations across the world?
This is a sad part of the story here, is that we do on paper. So South Africa's laws around weapons exports in particular explicitly require our regulators to take into account the risks that Zen is speaking about, the risks that our weapons might make conflicts worse or be used to target civilians and commit war crimes and other violations of international law. And so the law in South Africa is very clear that when a weapons company goes to the NCACC as the regulator and says, we'd like a permit to export weapons to Saudi Arabia, and this is what we'd like to send and how many, that the committee needs to take into account a range of factors. Those factors include the likelihood of a risk of increased conflict because of that export, but also any risk that violations of human rights are going to occur. And so that's the situation on paper. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a disconnect between the way South Africa speaks about Yemen on the international stage and then the way our domestic politicians and bureaucrats actually process the decisions. And so, as you've said, our diplomats have gone to the United Nations and said that they are very concerned about the violations of international law and the widespread famine and human rights violations in Yemen. And yet, at home in South Africa, they've asked almost none of the same questions when approving weapons exports and have consistently, over the years of the conflict, despite the UN reports that Zen mentions that have been publicly available saying that these countries are complicit in war crimes, they have consistently permitted the exports anyway.
You mentioned the current regulator, the NCACC, known as the National Conventional Arms Control Committee. How effective has the NCACC been in monitoring the trade of these weapons?
The evidence in the report, that's based on the interactions that Open Secrets had with the NCACC, shows that they haven't been effective at all. I think that it's deeply disturbing what we've discovered because there were two possible ways the NCACC, I think, could have responded to us. The one would have been to say, look, we've considered all the evidence available and we don't think that it's sufficiently concerning to warrant stopping exports. Now, we would argue that that's wrong if they'd said that, and then I think that you could challenge that decision. But in fact, the NCACC don't even go that far. In their response to our letter to them, essentially they admit to not taking that information into account, even when it was publicly available. In one of the most remarkable discoveries in the investigation, we asked them whether they had taken into account United Nations reports on South African mortars made by likely Rheinmetall Denel munitions that were found at the site of a mortar attack in Yemen that killed civilians. And essentially the NCACC said to us, no, if it hasn't been brought to their attention through diplomatic channels or by the Department of International Relations, they don't need to take into account. I mean, we think that that's a kind of flagrant disregard for their legal duties to take into account those kind of serious allegations. And essentially what we've seen is that even that information in the public domain doesn't seem to have been fully accounted for when the decisions were made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, thank you for that. So who are the other corporates and countries involved in benefiting from the trade of arms used in Yemen? Because we've mentioned Rheinmetall and we've mentioned South Africa and the Saudi-led coalition. Can you mention any other countries and corporates?
I mean, there's a host of other countries, obviously, and corporations that have been entangled in this long-going civil war in Yemen, and arming the forces that are involved in the war. But I think two that I'll mention in particular is that the United States and the United Kingdom, who through their fueling of these two states and their fueling have been the largest suppliers of weapons that have fueled this conflict. And so actually between 2015 and 2018, the US topped the list of countries that were exporting and delivering weapons to those involved, to the states involved in the Yemen war. And to the effect of from around between $10 billion and $3 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, respectively. And so these, and I'm sorry to mention, as we speak about in the report, these deliveries constitute only around 10% of the weapons offers made to Saudi Arabia and the UAE during this period. And just to mention that the UK, as the United Kingdom, has been single-handedly, as we explain in the report, responsible for the Saudi Air Force, which has been able to carry out relentless aerial bombing campaigns for over 6 years now. And this, just to mention a few of the stats of that, it's killed around over 22,000 individuals. And so through companies such as BAE, which are other companies, and countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, we see, a lot of involvement by states around the world and companies around the world that fueled the war in Yemen. And Italy has also been named as amongst the countries that have been involved in this, in particular in connection with Rheinmetall. And actually Italy has just stopped their exports to arms exports to UAE and Saudi Arabia. Germany as well, of course, has been deeply involved in the exports, but because of the German ban, their companies based in Germany, have found other ways. And so German weapons are still, even though the state has banned the weapons exports, German-made weapons are still ending up in Yemen.
What needs to happen to end profiteering from the war in Yemen?
I think in the report, I'll talk to 5 things that we talk about in the report that we say need to happen to stop this profiteering from the Yemen war. And the first is that the NCACC needs to end weapons exports to parties involved in the Yemen conflict. And by that, we're saying that the NCACC should immediately stop export permits from South Africa destined and stop export permits that allow weapons to leave South Africa and end up in countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so that's the first thing. And then we ask in that same breath for the NCACC to recall existing permits and to revoke those. And the second thing that we call for is for the NCACC to end its secrecy problem. The law must be amended to require more regular and detailed reporting by the NCACC to Parliament, and Parliament must call the NCACC to account when it fails to report timelessly and accurately. And the third thing that we say is that the DIRCO, the Department of International Relations and Corporations, must make human rights central to foreign policy. South Africa's foreign policy is in a muddle, and I think we've seen this. There is profound incoherence when it comes to stated commitments to constitutional values and their implementation. So DIRCO must develop a concrete plan to implement their stated commitment to human rights. And the fourth thing we call for is that the Hawks must investigate companies based in South Africa, arms companies based in South Africa, such as RDM, Rheinmetall Denel Munitions. And so the Directorate for Priority Crimes Investigations of the Hawks is required to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so we call on the Hawks to immediately investigate the possible complicity of South African companies such as RDM and Hensoldt in war crimes and other violations of international law in Yemen. And I think the fifth and the one of the important ones, they're all important, but one of the ones that we say we can take action now as people is for civil society to stand together in solidarity with the people in Yemen. So challenging the status quo in South Africa, in the South African arms sector, will require a new kind of solidarity between civil society and groups of and other civil society groups in other countries, such as South Africa and Germany, to challenge the powerful corporations and states that have been complicit in fueling this war. And we must be led by the call for solidarity made by the people of Yemen and respond strongly and effectively to that call.
Very true, very true. Thank you so much, then.
So I actually wanted to return to something, a question that you asked earlier, Tlhogi, which, I think I left something out there that's quite important, which is, what has the NCACC been doing? And I spoke about the evidence that they haven't been adequately taking, this evidence into account and how deeply disturbing that is. But the other thing to note, and this is very important based on what Zen has been saying, that there is an ongoing struggle in so many of these countries by civil society to stop the export of weapons. So in the United Kingdom, the matter is still before the courts, with civil society saying that it is a violation of UK law to continue to supply weapons to, for example, the Saudi Air Force in the context of these violations. In South Africa, it is important to remember that there was a brief moment where there was a de facto ban on weapons going from South Africa to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And the ban originated when those countries refused to sign off what is called an end-user certificate, which is a certificate used in the sale of weapons to ensure that whoever you are selling the weapons to does not pass them on. And we've long had a clause in South African certificates that says that it requires the buying country to allow an inspector sporadically to check whether those requirements are being complied with. South Africa moved that requirement to the front page of the end-user certificate, and the countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE and a few others essentially freaked out and said, if that's going to be a requirement, we're actually not going to do this. Now, this in and of itself should be a red flag as to the entire system, because if inspections are not going to be permitted, purportedly because it's a violation of their sovereignty, it raises questions about how on earth you're going to enforce where the weapons end up and whether the requirements of the law are being upheld. That's the first thing. But then, of course, the other thing is that, and we've written this in the reports, is that this was the moment where South Africa could have said, no, if you're not going to comply with something that's been a legal requirement forever here, we're actually going to stop this, because that raises serious concerns in addition to all of the evidence of human rights violations. And unfortunately, what the NCACC did was the opposite. It bowed to the interests of the arms companies. Weapons companies such as RDM, Rheinmetall Denel, in South Africa went to them and said, it's costing us too much money, you have to find a way around this. And very swiftly, they changed the requirement. Now, in terms of that end-user certificate, we are only required to do inspection by diplomatic process. I still do not know what that means. We asked the NCACC to confirm, and they do not provide any answer that explains, what that would mean or whether it would be rigorous enough. And so there was really a missed opportunity there where, we could have stopped it. And instead, what we did is the country found a way around it to allow weapons to continue. And so then to come back to this question now about, what needs to be done. In South Africa, first and foremost, we need the NCACC to start applying their minds to the law and taking this kind of evidence into account. They can no longer hide behind the fact that they do not know what's happening in Yemen. And I think that one of the really positive things to have come out of the Profiting from Misery report so far is that suddenly they are being asked questions that they haven't been asked before. We've seen the Minister of Public Enterprises, we've seen the CEO of Denel being called by parliamentarians to explain what's happening. And we really hope that this prompts the NCACC and the Parliamentary Committee on Defence to say, we really need to review these decisions and we need to really reconsider whether our law permits these kinds of exports, and to take a stand and to say, actually, even if it is profitable for the South African arms industry, we have to draw the line when there's such evidence of these kinds of crimes, and to stop the export. So that is the kind of first thing that we can do, I think.
All right, thank you so much, Mike. How would you relate this report to Open Secrets' other work on the arms deal and on apartheid-era arms sanctions busting? And what does this reveal about the nature of arms trade in South Africa?
South Africa has such a checkered history, and it's probably one of the countries that you could look at that provides you such the perfect window into the kind of corrupt and criminal nature of so much of the global arms trade. And so Open Secrets' work in the past has focused on a range of areas that touches on how economic crime and the arms trade intersects. Our work on apartheid, guns and money revealed the nature of the kind of global networks from arms companies and governments and middlemen that systematically enabled the apartheid regime to violate international law, to bust sanctions, and to get weapons in that fueled the apartheid military machine, both domestically and in terms of its wars on the continent. And, our work on the arms deal showed that so many of those networks that facilitated that were back facilitating corrupt deals during the 1999 arms deal. I think that what this investigation touches on and shows is that South Africa has failed to break with that past despite a very public recognition within the state that they needed to. And so there was a commission of inquiry called the Cameron Commission of Inquiry in the 1990s, set up by the Mandela administration specifically to look at the way the arms trade operated and the arms industry operated in South Africa. And the conclusions of that report were simple. It was that the industry had long operated with complete impunity, in total secrecy, and that it violated the law consistently, and that it was contributing to human rights violations and conflicts around the world, because the excess and glut of South African weapons during the late apartheid era were then exported to conflicts around the world. And so in my earlier answer, I spoke about South African law and what it requires the regulator to take into account. That law stems explicitly from an attempt to break from the past. And so it's not simply some kind of bureaucratic requirement that's being violated here. Instead, it is a violation of the law that specifically sets out to attempt to break with that past of criminality, secrecy, and impunity. And I think that it's a reminder to us that this struggle is a very long one, and that our attempts to get the NCACC and the rest of the state to hold these corporations to account and say, no, you cannot profit from these types of conflicts, that it is a battle to break a long chain of that type of conduct. But that if we don't do it now, we will be having the same conversation in 10 years' time. We look at conflicts that are burgeoning in places like Mozambique today, and no doubt that will start in other parts of the world. We need to make sure that our systems are working properly to stop South Africans profiting from those types of conflicts.
No, thank you so much. Mike and Zen, thank you for joining me today and answering the questions. And hopefully the report Profiting from Misery is a step in the right direction to having some accountability. Thank you so much.
So much, Lockie.
Thank you, Lockie.
Open Secrets is a non-profit organization. To keep our work independent, we do not accept funding from corporations or governments. We would really appreciate it if you would consider donating to Open Secrets to allow us to continue to challenge war profiteering, illicit financial flows, and other forms of corruption. Visit opensecrets.org.za/support to donate to us using SnapScan, GiveGain, PayPal, or EFT.